We are proud to present an original lecture by Jason Farago, one of the preeminent voices in art criticism today. The talk will be presented in English and will be followed by a questions period in French and English. Thank you for being with us tonight. And now, please welcome Liliane Maurer from Art Speaks.
Bonsoir à tous. Je suis ravie d'être ici avec vous après plus que 2 ans de Covid. Et je suis tellement heureuse que Jason Farago est ici avec nous ce soir. Jason and I met about 3 years ago in Fogo Island. Besides liking him as a person, I was struck by his brilliant mind, his deep knowledge of art history, and how he synthesizes that knowledge with his equally deep understanding of subjects like climate change, politics, and life in general. I knew then that I wanted to invite him to Montreal to speak under the banner of Art Speaks. Tonight, in partnership with the Musée des beaux-arts, I am thrilled that this has become a reality. Besides Jason's insightful writing as culture critic at large at the New York Times, he initiated a project called Close Read, in which he uses technology to allow him to analyze a work of art in a way that we, the viewer, can get much closer to the meaning and heart of the work. Just the other day, I viewed his most recent close read on a Dutch still life painting from the 17th century that was a lesson in art history, a trip around the world, and an intimate reading of a beautiful painting. I urge you to look it up. I started Art Speaks 6 years ago with the desire to give back to my community and to provoke conversation and thought around the arts. As we know, openness and sharing ideas propels new thought and creativity. Mojane Bazadi and I worked together to bring artists, curators, writers, and thinkers to Montreal, and we've been most heartened by your response. People like Thelma Golden, Theaster Gates, Catherine Opie, among others, have profoundly inspired us and lifted us up. On a personal note, I really must thank Mojane Bazadi for her professionalism, her friendship, and her commitment to Art Speaks. You're a joy to work with. The Montreal Museum of Fine Arts is close to my heart, and so it's a very special pleasure to share this evening with you. Thank you to Mélanie Deveau, Charlène Bélanger, and Marie-Claude Lisée and her team in communications for their invaluable help. And now, I'd like to give the floor to Stéphane Arquin, director of the Musée des beaux-arts, who will introduce Jason.
Bonsoir, merci Liliane. C'est un bonheur de vous voir tous en si grand nombre. C'est la première fois que je vois autant de personnes dans l'auditorium depuis novembre 2020 quand je suis revenu au musée. Donc, bienvenue au musée, vous êtes chez vous, évidemment. Liliane, thank you so much. We are so happy to partner with you, with Art Speaks, Liliane and Mojane. It's a great opportunity indeed for Montrealers from all walks to have access to such great thinkers of the contemporary art world, as Jason Farago is. Comme vous, Liliane, j'ai vu récemment cette édition du Close Read sur une nature morte de Heda, extraordinaire, et ce qui distingue, je pense, la manière Jason Farago, et je le dis d'ailleurs, il est parfaitement bilingue. Si ce n'est pas trilingue ou quadrilingue, donc il faut se méfier de lui. Il parle un français impeccable. C'est ce savoir très, très, très profond de l'histoire de l'art. C'est une pensée qui est informée, c'est une pensée qui va de l'avant, mais qui tient compte d'un riche savoir du passé, et ça, c'est remarquable. I will briefly introduce Jason because he is, as I was saying, his French is perfect. Nonetheless, he'll be speaking in English tonight. And so I will introduce him and just very briefly mention his professional accomplishments. Apologize. Jason Farago, critic at large for the New York Times, writes about art and culture in the US and abroad. In 1922, he was awarded one of the inaugural Silvers-Dudley prizes for criticism and journalism. He began writing about art for the Times in 2015, and since then he has reviewed exhibitions, conducted interviews, and reported features across the United States and in a dozen foreign countries, among which at Farago Island in Canada. In 2020, he helped develop Close Read, which Lynn was mentioning, a digital initiative that elaborates the meaning of a single work of art detail by detail. It's a fascinating read. He previously wrote for The Guardian, serving as its first US art critic and as an online opinion columnist. He has also been a regular contributor to The New Yorker, the BBC, NPR, the New York Review of Books, and Art Forum. He co-founded and served as editor-in-chief of the art magazine Even, whose 10-issue run is collected in the anthology Out of Practice, Motto Books 2018. Mr. Farago was born in New York. He holds a bachelor, where he still lives. He holds a bachelor's degree from Yale University and a master's degree from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, both in art history. His last name rhymes with Chicago. Jason, all yours.
Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci à vous, Stéphane, pour cette introduction et pour cette surestimation de ma connaissance de la langue française. Merci. Thank you so much, Lillian, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again after a number of years. It's a pleasure to see you in person, I should say. It's a pleasure to see so many of you in person. We've been looking forward to doing this for a long time, and I think it's really special that we're able to do this in person and not over Zoom. So much of what we're going to be talking about tonight is about the advantages and disadvantages, the sort of foreseeable and not foreseeable advantages and disadvantages of living lives on screens. And therefore, I couldn't be happier to be off my screen and to see all of you here in person. So thank you very much, Lillian. Thank you, Mojane. And thank you, everyone at ArtSpeaks and at the Musée des Beaux-Arts for making this possible. What I want to speak about tonight, sorry, just a little lighting is better over here, good. What I wanted to speak about tonight is the place of art in contemporary digital life, but not only that. I have this wonderful title of critic at large, and although art is sort of my principal engagement, it's not the only one, and this talk is only partially about art as such. It is just as much about the places that we experience art, the mechanisms by which we discover art, the networks through which art circulates, mutates as it circulates, and comes to us in fashions that we might not have known about before. Over the last, I don't know, 20 years, but really over the last sort of 6 or 7, sort of since the rise of the camera phone. The iPhone is born in 2007, Instagram is born in 2011, and it becomes sort of properly in everybody's pockets around 2014, 15, 16, I guess I would say. We've lived through this dissolution of the borders between art and life in ways that, you know, we actually spoke about in the 20th century, in the sort of high modernist moment, but weren't ever as true as they seem to be now. You know, one of the hallmarks of modernism, of modern art, modern literature, was this idea, this overarching desire to render the border between art and life porous, if not entirely to expunge it, if not all to render it sort of wholly irrelevant. That was the rhetoric. There was this effort, at least, as sort of art moved out of the academy and into the independent show, the Salon des Refusés, the realms of the avant-garde, to dismantle certain expectations about what art was, where art was encountered, how art appeared, and how art functioned. And what was underestimated, I think, and what we've learned now, is throughout the 20th century, particularly in the later 20th century, there was sort of the place of the institution within this anti-institutional logic, the place of a thing like a museum or an art magazine or a newspaper as the sort of invisible frame that made certain forms of contesting what art could be legible to a public like you and me. I mean, I come back all the time to the classic example of Duchamp's fountain, the urinal that was placed on a pedestal in the 1917 Armory show, and that is regularly invoked as the sort of originary moment of the sort of end of one kind of art and the beginning of the other, the idea that art is whatever the sort of artist proclaims it. What I think is underestimated in this wonderful originary moment is not the urinal, but the pedestal. And what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is not about the urinal, it is about the pedestal. It is about where these pedestals come from, who determines where the pedestals go, and what happens when the pedestal is, along with the urinal, something that you might photograph and something that might leave the space of the Armory show and go into the same feed in which you would encounter pictures of your grandchildren, pictures from the war in Ukraine, coupons to save money on your next Amazon purchase, and most recently, I couldn't help but put this in. Last week, my Instagram account was hacked. And someone got my password and was using my account to shill for cryptocurrency. So in case you were, this was not me, but apparently I was posting pictures of my alleged bank account and harassing just about everybody in the New York art world to send money by way of Nigeria. The question I want to talk about tonight is about this, right? It's about it's not, has digitalization been good or bad for art? It's happened. We're not going back, right? It is an inevitable thing. The question, and what is more, is an incomplete thing, right? One's personal life and one's digital life are always sort of porous. There's no sort of clean dividing line between online and offline. COVID taught us this. The question I want to ask tonight is sort of in what ways, with what strategies, astuces, as you would say here, can artists, can art institutions, can art audiences account for the sort of shifting apparatus of our digital lives when we encounter art in places, in formats, in streams that we never had before, and where the kind of distinction around art, that pedestal that Duchamp was able to rely on, are at best dissolving, possibly no longer there at all. And Stefan and Lillian were being very kind to me about my sort of historical engagement with these questions. The point I want to make tonight, and I want to talk to all of you about tonight, is that these new questions around the place of art and the definition of art against new technological constraints, new technological challenges, though the technologies are new, the challenge of facing up to new technologies as an artist is not a new one. That one goes way back. And I therefore sort of perversely want to start talking about Instagram by going all the way back to one of the sort of originary moments of selfies, I suppose we could say. This is Albrecht Dürer in 1498. It's not the very first self-portrait, but it's one of the very first. And, you know, there was already, at this moment in the late 15th century, I mean, oil paint had been invented, I suppose, about 60 years previous, around the 1430s, I think it was. I'm not sure. But around that time, oil paint, which is sort of slower drying times relative to tempera, had produced this sort of image explosion in the Low Countries and then eventually imported to Italy and to Germany. And Dürer was one of the very first artists to paint, one of the first named artists, just to be more precise, to paint self-portraits that were valuable not simply because they were beautiful or because they were made of expensive things like gold or lapis lazuli or something like this, but because they represented an individual person, an individual genius, we might even say. And that the value and the importance of a picture like this one, I mean, before 1500, let's say, before Dürer's time, the idea of being an artist was like being a goldsmith or a carpenter, or, you know, it was a craft that you could do better or worse. You'd usually club together in guilds, and value, importance, would be determined based on the amount of labor that went into the picture, the amount, you know, if there was a lot of blue because you had the Virgin Mary, that would cost you more because blue is the most expensive color to produce. that all changes around 1500. And why does it change? In large part because of this other work by Dürer. This is St. Jerome in his study. Because of the hottest new technology on the block, which of course was the printing press. The introduction of movable type and woodblock prints in the sort of mid to late 15th century poses this elemental question to artists, a little less to writers, about what makes a work of art, what makes an image a work of art by a particular artist? And what is it, if not the labor and the gesture of the hand that would indicate that this is a Dürer, and therefore is valuable or is important in a way that a counterfeit or a work by some other person might not be. If the artist's hand was absent, as it is in the case of a woodblock print, then, if the uniqueness of the object is gone, and these things could be churned out by the hundreds, by the thousands in the sort of print shops of Nuremberg, then value was going to have to come from somewhere else. And of course, in Dürer's case, it came from this idea of the artist as individual genius, touched by God, with a combination of both tactile, physical facility with the burin, with the engraving mechanism, and with something more intellectual, something more humanistic, something that came from up here, if not from up here, and not simply from here. And what you begin to see in Dürer, with the introduction of this monogram, and again, Dürer was not the first to do this, Martin Schongauer and some people before, but ultimately Dürer was the most visible and most gifted. Here's, of course, the classic Melancholia with, in the top right, the Dürer square, where the numbers all add up to 34 if you go every column vertical, every row horizontal, I believe along the diagonals and in the corners as well. And then ultimately the sort of secret little AD that, where's my AD? Oh, there it is, yeah. The AD was the proof that this was not just a piece of paper that had been printed in a print house, and maybe not even a print house in Nuremberg, but a print house in Venice, but was a Dürer. And that gets fed back, not just from printmaking, but right into painting. This is Dürer's famous self-portrait, and one of the sort of first close reads I did in my series. The idea that a unique work of art, like a painting, would have its value determined in the same way as a print by the artist's individual genius, and not simply by more direct economic concerns. This is the originary moment for me of how technological change produces a redefinition of art. Not just, new media like a print, but a full reassessment of all media, new media and old media, in the shadow of some kind of new technology. That's what I'm interested in learning from the past, and those are the kind of lessons from the past I think we can apply today. There are no one-to-one applications, but what you do have are case studies or moments of insight, I suppose, in which you can see how a new technology or how a new mode of image creation doesn't just sort of come up next to painting or sculpture and say, can you do this, can you do that, but forces artists and also, of course, art spectators to rethink the entire sort of champ, the entire field of image making, and to rethink their project in that way. I'm not going to talk too much about sort of all kinds of new image technologies. The camera obscura, these are some sort of 18th century prints. You get the, what do you call it, in the little lighthouse, the mirror that projects the landscape onto the little rotating table. And one that I've always been very interested in, which is the physiognotrace. Do any of you know this? This is in the late 18th century, a prime Enlightenment piece of technology in which to produce better portraits, you'd sit in the chair, and your shadow would be cast on that white panel there. And with the, what do you call it, that sort of plumb weight, the artist would drag the a stylus along the contours of your face, which would make the pen move on the panel that was at the top. Or if I'm not mistaken, that one actually might be an engraving, a plate. And therefore could produce images like you have on the right, that's Thomas Jefferson, that were seen as more faithful and more accurate depictions of humanity than a mere drawing. None, of course, more important than the one that sort of happens in 1839. I'm just going to play a clip. From the laughter, you might know this movie. Turner by Mike Lee, with Timothy Spall as J.M.W. Turner, and in my estimation, the only good movie ever made about an artist. You can only imagine in 1839 or a little later when they would have set up studios in London like this, what it must have been like to have a daguerreotype made. And as you can hear from Turner's dialogue, of course, the interest in optics and the interest in new technologies was already there among painters like Turner, for whom amateur science and forms of optical reproduction were, of course, something that a contemporary artist would have engaged with in a place like the Royal Academy. But with the invention of photography, painting and sculpture and drawing have what seems like a mortal threat before them, right? In 1839, which, and you may know, photography is one of these weird things that was invented twice in two different formats in France and in Britain, daguerre on these silver plates and Talbot on paper. And that moment, I mean, there's the famous Paul Delaroche moment, who says, "À partir d'aujourd'hui, la peinture est morte." And whether that was true or not, what is certainly true is that certain kinds of painting did undergo a kind of death in 1839. I mean, military painting, the idea that you'd win a battle and then you commission a sort of giant panorama of like the Battle of Valmy or something like this, that did fade out in the mid-19th century because of better forms of reproductive images. Botanical illustration and other forms of scientific illustration gave way to reproductive imagery like this. But by the 1860s, artists were beginning to artists working in traditional media, I should say, were beginning to metabolize the sort of lessons of photography and the opportunities of photography into sort of one painterly tool among others. And on the left, you're looking at a photo by Nadar, and on the right, a classically overstuffed Orientalist picture by Jérôme. It's Phryne before the Areopagus from 1861, in which either commissioning photographs or working with a camera like on your own, like Thomas Eakins would in Philadelphia. Degas also was a photographer, an amateur photographer. Or, more interesting to me, is the sort of the manner in which living a life surrounded by photographs transforms the painterly project itself. More interesting, as always for me, of course, is Manet. What you're looking at is 1868. It's Mademoiselle Klaus. It's not Le Balcon. It's the same balcony as Le Balcon, but this one's in the Ashmolean in Oxford. And the cropping, you're looking. That's not a crop. That's the whole painting. But that bizarre cropping of half a dress on one side, the asymmetry, the fleetingness, the interest in fashion. So much of this is that birth of modern art in Paris in the 1860s is one whose contours are shaped as much by the media conditions and the social conditions of Manet's life as they were by the history of painting that Manet would have studied with couture at the Academy. My favorite example of this, and actually my favorite painting on this continent, is the one on the right. It's in Philadelphia. It's the Battle of the Alabama and the Kearsarge from 1864. This is a weird thing about the American Civil War, is that there was one battle in Europe, just off the coast of Cherbourg. And what you're looking at on the left is, I couldn't find I don't think anyone's actually ever identified the particular image, but this is a very similar image, at least, that appeared in Harper's in 1864. The battle took place in the end of June 1864, and the Union triumphed. And what you're looking at is the sort of sinking, flaming Kearsarge, I'm sorry, the Alabama is the one that's on fire. The Kearsarge is the little one in the background, and the sort of French fisherman who's trying to come to their rescue. That was in June, late June, 1864. This painting appears in Paris in mid-July, 1864, about 3 weeks later. Manet, of course, was not in Cherbourg. He did not witness it. What he did see was pictures like the one on the left. And Manet, this is 1864, this is the exact moment of Olympia, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, all the great paintings that go into the Salon des Refusés. And Manet was already beginning to understand modern life, and in this case, modern war, as at least partially a media condition, as something that was shaped by media imagery and media transmission, and not simply by eyewitness eyesight, or on the other hand, from like total invention of the imagination. The idea that reproductive imagery, and reproductive imagery that was encountered in the mass media and not in a specialized publication, might be the stuff of art, and not just the stuff of art, but the stuff of immediate, like fleshy history painting, is something that happened very quickly, and that I think we are the sort of heirs to. I think, you know, as we've lived through this appalling war in Ukraine, I think we've all realized that these images of war are things that circulate in ways that we cannot fully predict, and that flow into our lives in commercial manners and not simply in documentary manners, in formats that have advertising around them. If you're scrolling through Instagram and you get a sort of promo for a weight loss supplement or a trip to Portugal or something at the same time. I mean, these are very contemporary questions, if you ask me. This is, of course, around the same time that people are getting cameras, what do you call it, personal cameras, right? The invention of the Kodak Brownie, and I love that picture of the woman on the right, the idea that something would be of so little value that you might actually just take it in your little canoe. But I'm less interested in, well, how to say this? I guess what I would like to suggest is that it's not simply a story about new image technologies, but about new technologies of image transfer, image communication, that are really what is pushing pressure, I think, on a lot of these kind of developments in art history. And though we often say that we're living through unprecedented times, and I think that there's a kernel of truth to some of that, I think it's worth remembering that it's not just that reproductive imagery, from the printing press to photography to what we're living through now, has a history, but image transfer, image communication has a longer history, I think, than we necessarily give it credit for. What you're looking at on the right is one of the very first electronically transmitted images. It's called a pantelegraph. It was invented in 1856, the machine, I mean, was invented in 1856 by an Italian guy called Giovanni Caselli. What you would do is you would write, or you would draw your message on that metal plate, which is the curvy thing, right? And you would do that using an ink that, what do you call it? That is not electrically conducive. And so the negative would be then transmitted through the tick, 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 tick thing that you see to the right. And what you could produce is a visual telegram like the one on the right. And as early as the 1850s, therefore, you have this idea that individuals, and not only a media instrument like where Manet would have seen that picture, are capable of transmitting images across long distances. This was refined in the first decade of the 20th century with the Bildtelegraph, invented by that guy on the right called Arthur Kohn in Munich in like 1903 or 4, but ultimately around so this is how it would work, right? So you would, the image would go on that what do you call that, circular tube, and it would be rasterized into these lines, and the tick, 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 tick of the telegraph would then be recomposed on the receiver's side, not unlike what happened with fax machines later on. If you wanted to do the over-decorated general on the left, that one would take about half an hour. You could do it faster if you were willing to rasterize the image and put up with lower picture quality. It took quite a number of years to refine the technology, but by 1907, this is Kaiser Wilhelm in the very first electronically transmitted image to appear in a mass media publication. In Das Illustrierte, I think it's called, something like that. No, Interessant, I forget. It's the very first telegraphed picture. And the New York Times, a paper I know a little bit, reported on it with the breathlessness of the Lindbergh crossing. They said, I don't know if you can read it, what they predicted. This is 1907. Lovers conversing at a great distance will behold each other as in the flesh. Doctors will examine patients' tongues in another city, and the poor will enjoy visual trips wherever their fancy inclines. In hot weather, too, alpine glaciers and Arctic snows will be made visible in sweltering cities, and when piercing northeast winds do blow, we shall gloat over tropical vistas of orchids and palms. The sort of prefiguration of the sort of travel inspo figure on your Instagram feed at this moment. The Bildtelegraph was not only used in mass media, it was also used by the police. That's how you got like the wanted pictures across large distances. And there were even attempts to introduce these technologies to individual consumers. What you're looking at here is the picture wireless from the 1920s. I think it's an English one on the left and the German version on the right. These were things that you could buy. They cost a fortune, though, for your house. And you could get movie star pictures that would come over the wireless and be reproduced in your home. These and even you could send them to your loved ones in the manner that you might send a photo on your phone today. At the height of the Third Reich, what you're looking at is the Bildtelegraph office in, I think it's Frankfurt, I can't remember, but the example that you're looking at on the right is from Frankfurt. It's from, I can't read the Briefmark here, 37. The picture is actually as blurry in the original as it is in this reproduction, and it says, viele Grüße von Onkel, what do you call it? Much love from your little uncle, can't read the words, Bildtelegrafie, by picture telegraph. These would have been miraculous things to receive. Nevertheless, they didn't represent at the sort of cost to speed proportion a sufficient improvement over the post to become things that became widespread consumer technologies. And they did kind of fade out after the war. In the mass media, wire photos remained the way that most images were transferred throughout the 20th century. What you're looking at on the left is the classic way. And so what do you call it? The picture would be read and turned into sound, and then it could be dialed in to the newsroom over the phone, which lasted until the mid-1980s when the machine on the right was developed. That's the Dixel 2000 pixel transmitter, developed by Hasselblad in Sweden, which instead of analog telegraphy would allow you to just put the negatives in the machine and you could scan the negatives in the field rather than developing the picture in the field and sending the positive as sound. And you could send them into the main office over the phone lines. And then in 1997, I wonder if anyone knows what the picture on the right is? That's baby Sophie from Santa Cruz, California. Her father is the guy on the right, a guy called Philippe Kahn, some tech guy. And in 1997, when his wife gave birth to baby Sophie, there was still no wireless. You still had to plug sort of early laptops. I had one of those. It kind of looked like a toilet seat. It weighed like 50 pounds. You would plug that into sort of Ethernet jack. But what you did have already by 1997 was the Motorola StarTAC. Do you remember the flip phone that kind of looked like a clamshell? the phone itself did not have a camera, but what Philippe Kahn had was an early digital camera. Remember the ones with like the little screen on the back? And I guess it was like the kind of phone charger that you would have in your car that would plug into the cigarette lighter. And through some kind of jerry-rigged operation between the Casio digital camera, the Motorola StarTAC, his own computer, and the Ethernet of the hospital, this guy sent the first camera phone picture, albeit one made with a phone that did not take pictures, in the way that many photographs were made without cameras in the 1840s and 1850s, but without leaving his wife's bedside, without having to go to the office and take the memory stick out of the camera. He could, in the presence of the mother and in the presence of baby Sophie, transmit the picture to his friends. This was a big deal. I got my first email address around this time, I suppose, right? 1997. I would have been 14. I mean, I had like Prodigy, CompuServe. Do you remember those? But I probably, and the internet was still something that you went to like the computer lab to do. And I am an old millennial, right? I'm 38. I got the internet as a teen. I didn't grow up with it. And the internet, therefore, still has certain contours that I can see rather than being the kind of like fish unable to describe the water that I think people 10 years younger than me might have, which is not a criticism. I envy you. But, you know, I got Facebook while I was in college in 2004, back when it was thefacebook.com, and you could only have one picture. And I think it's worth remembering, as when we talk about image conditions and media conditions in the 21st century, that a lot of what we mean actually sort of begins around 2010 with the rise of the smartphone, and not necessarily with the internet. This is my favorite example of this. On the top is the election of Pope Benedict in 2005. The bottom is the election of Pope Francis in 2013. What are you supposed to do in a situation like this if you're an artist? I don't think it's so easy. There have been artists who have taken the conditions that you're seeing in the bottom picture as literally as they can, and this was kind of early on in the sort of, you can tell from the typography on the screenshot. This is Amalia Ullman, the Argentine artist, who in the sort of early days of Instagram, when it was still seen as chic to put like push-button filters that would now like mark you as a real tryhard, you know, she would essentially perform as this sort of airhead heiress. And you know, she'd take pictures at La Durée eating her macarons and like going to Gucci and having and you know, and you can even see the particular kind of duck face pose of the lips, the pouting lips, as really sort of marking the time. That was sort of one interesting moment. I don't think it's an especially productive model to enter the stream itself in the same way that somebody like Dürer or somebody like Manet would have sort of learned from these new image conditions how to think about all media in new ways. I think that is really what I want to talk to you for the rest of this talk about, is about what kind of new art and what kind of new art institutions ought to be coming out of conditions like this one. In the 20th century, you know, we are hardly the first people to feel overwhelmed by imagery, overwhelmed by news, to have the feeling that life is moving a little too fast, that things are circulating a little too quickly, and you know, it's like the hallmark of stream of consciousness narration in modernist literature comes from this sense that we've lost our bearings with the past, and everything is kind of afloat, that all that is solid has melted into air. And the example that I come back to over and over again about how artists today can think about our contemporary media conditions, is from 100 years ago. It's the birth of Cubism, and in particular, synthetic Cubism, a little later on. This was another of the close reads that I did. Well, not this one, but a similar one by Juan Gris. And the moment in which Cubism is born is, of course, this utter moment of utter media saturation. If I'm not mistaken, no, I actually am pretty sure of this. Paris did have the greatest number of newspapers of any place on earth. You could get like 40 different dailies. And the sense that that truth or the news was becoming a matter of consumer choice, that the formerly distant world had flooded Paris, that there was less and less distance between things that are fine and things that are cheap, between things that are prestigious and things that are commonplace, is one that you could have responded to if you were a member of the Academy and if you were a kind of anti-modernist hater with a certain elitist distance, right? With a projection, a reestablishment of borders between high and low, between prestigious and everyday. That was not what the Cubists did, and in particular with Cubist collage. The introduction of the sort of mucky stuff of real life, on ne truquera plus les œuvres d'art. Not just what you're looking at on the left is a sort of early analytic cubism by Braque, but what you get 3 years later in Greece, the introduction of not just newspapers, but like, what do you call them? Scandal sheets, like Le Journal, which is a sort of, with faits divers, like, John murders prostitute, fisherman finds $1 million francs in the bottom of the boat, that kind of thing. Or cheap, what do you call them? Vampire novels like Fantômas, which you're looking at on the left. This idea that when the old forms seemed to be losing distinction, and when the proliferation of media got to be too much, what synthetic cubism, and Greece in particular, did was to say no to anti-media snobbery, but also no to the easy comfort of the image stream, the easy comfort of the new thing. That what was required was a neither nor, or perhaps a both and response that fashioned anew things that are old and things that are new, things that are prestigious and things that are commonplace, things that are unique and things that are reproduced into a new kind of looking. And Picasso himself, with the drawings and the collages that were done with stock prices, with, what do you call them, furniture ads, what do you call them, the steamer to get from Folkestone to Calais, and in particular, with collage, I find an enormously valuable example for contemporary artists of how to make new things from contemporary media conditions, and indeed, of course, to sort of find yourself in the fragmentary, incomplete, broken detritus of sort of modern life. Something similar did happen in the 1960s with pop, which, at least at its best, it didn't really always happen, but at its best, sort of contested, or that's not the right word, heightened the contradictions, I suppose, of mass media in like Warhol's Death and Disaster series, or in something like Lichtenstein's Wham, made it during the Vietnam War. It didn't last, and I think a lot of pop ended up just getting sort of absorbed into the mass culture that it had tried to introduce to the realm of fine art rather than create something new in the way that the Cubists did. More important, I think, for our purposes tonight, as a sort of media thinker, is from around the same time, is Namjoon Paik, one of my great heroes, who, in a way that I think was profounder than most of the pop artists, understood mass communication and new media technologies as not just a medium in which he could make new things, but the general conditions under which you and I would encounter these new things. You're looking at Charlotte Moorman playing the TV cello on the left, and there's Paik, who should come to my apartment to untangle all the cables underneath my computer. Paik was a composer, of course, a Fluxus composer and a visual artist, but also an inventor of new media technologies. The Paik Abbey synthesizer, video synthesizer, which was invented in 1969, which brought these sort of video editing technologies out of the realm of the TV studio and into, it wasn't exactly a consumer technology, but at least towards something that an individual could do on his or her own. And with something like Global Groove, this is from 1973, new forms of distortion, of editing, and of colorization that in many ways prefigure a lot of the sort of push-button filters in contemporary sort of camera phone media. I mean, Global Groove, if you remember, do you know that sort of dumb, I don't do TikTok, I just sort of see the TikToks that are posted on my Twitter and Instagram accounts, but there's often this thing in which if you use slow motion, the slowed down audio track remains on the slow motion, and so instead of putting on a new soundtrack, you would have that kind of sound. That comes from Paik, right? Like, and it's sort of embarrassing that we always used to talk about Paik as the sort of godfather of video art, and he now seems to be the godfather of social media art too. You'd think someone new would come around. But not just in videos like Global Groove, but in the even more relevant to me, television transmissions that Paik made in the 1980s with the relatively new technology of simultaneous satellite broadcast communication. First in 1984 with Good Morning, Mr. Orwell, called that because it was the year 1984, and Paik was here to say, actually, it's great, like substantially more interesting than the Apple computer ad that said 1984 is not going to be like 1984, is Paik's live performance between New York and Paris, in which George Plimpton and Charlotte Moorman and Laurie Anderson could collaborate across the ocean and could be edited live by the artist. And then after that, in 1988, to coincide with the Seoul Olympics, when Paik did Wrap Around the World, which you're looking at is David Bowie and Ryuichi Sakamoto, and if I'm not mistaken, Bowie did his part in Japanese. These were the sort of, Paik was the first artist to foresee how mass media, in a way that was wholly unlike how Warhol thought, how mass media would give way to multi-directional communication in which everyone was going to be not just a receiver or a transmitter, that quite unlike Famous for 15 Minutes, in which you would go to the television studio for 15 minutes and then go back to obscurity. On the contrary, Shape Paik, everyone at all times was going to have a role of being both producer and consumer, of being both transmitter and receiver, in a worldwide network that he famously called, long before Al Gore used the phrase, the electronic superhighway. And I think Paik was totally right that we would all soon have our own television channels. They turned out not to be as optimistic, as humanistic, as global as he would have dreamed, nor could he have foreseen how they would facilitate a reactionary politics not seen since the 1930s. But by the 2010s, this is the moment in which I knew it was all going to change. This was Carol Walker's, it's called a subtlety. It's gigantic. I don't know if you can get a sense of the scale from this image, but this is, it's sort of like the Farine Five Roses of New York. This is the old Domino sugar factory in Williamsburg that was going to be demolished to make way for what else? Condos. And Carol Walker was given the run of the space to make this quite disturbing but also quite powerful massive Sphingian totem out of sugar. Walker has been using grotesque or otherwise disturbing imagery, often in the form of silhouettes, all the way back into the 1990s, and had courted quite a bit of controversy along the way. What was new, of course, was this. I had been thinking about, I downloaded Instagram in 2011. I thought it was really stupid. I was like, why am I taking a picture of my lunch and like putting a sepia filter on it to make it look like I'm like eating a croissant during the Civil War? This makes no sense. But around 2013, 2014, I guess, which coincides also with the introduction of the front-facing camera lens on, I believe it's the iPhone 4 or 4S. I don't remember which one it is, but it's around this time. The front-facing camera phone lens, I think, is a deeply underestimated disruption of our experience of art. And it was here, in Brooklyn, that I sort of first realized that there was going to be a totally new accounting for the experience of art. And that what we're going to live through would be, not to be too grandiose about it, was going to be as grand, at the very least as disruptive, that the camera phone was going to shape our experience of art in a way that the church used to shape it, or that the white cube used to shape it, and that we were going to have to come up with much better languages around imagery and photography in particular than what we'd all been relying on from our sort of Susan Sontag, Marshall McLuhan days. It was going to be, and I warn you, the next image is pretty disturbing. These were the images that were sort of coming out of the, this was the sort of first moment. I won't linger on it, I'm sorry, I think it's important to see. These particular forms of sort of self-performance and the kind of how the grotesqueries of American racism that Walker's 19th century derived imagery has always been relying on got reprocessed, recirculated, and liked and shared as naturally as if it was a day at the beach, was enormously disturbing to me. And yet, Walker was watching. And I'm just going to play a clip. Walker, at her next exhibition, I believe it was 2015 at Sycamore Jenkins, sort of quietly revealed that she'd been there the whole time.
먼저 한번 찍었어요, 이렇게 쭉.
Get a family shot.
Down or what?
No, stay where you are. Right there. Back up. Right there. Yeah.
Okay, that would be good.
That was 2014, the same year that Amalia Ullman was doing her performance on Instagram, and substantially more interesting than Ullman's détournement of the Instagram feed. Walker was, for me, probably the first artist I know, certainly the first one that I felt viscerally, who made the transmission of a non-digital work of art as social media imagery, and not just social media, but also news imagery, but principally social media imagery, into a constitutive part of the artist's task. That instead of saying, I make the work, I put it in the gallery, and then what happens after is none of my concern, she understood in a way that I find not just powerful, but ethical, that these works of art have many lives. They mutate as they migrate. And the artist, though not responsible for every reproduction at every moment on the chain, is in the business of creating something that is going to have many lives and that could get distorted as it circulates in the manner of a pantelegraph image, and that could get reconstituted in the manner of a daguerreotype, but that is going to be something that is a media event and not simply an object. And I think in particular for sculpture, not just for two-dimensional imagery, that's a very difficult thing to put into practice, and something I think Walker's done an incredible job with, Charlie Ray as well. You know, and by 2017, when Trump had been elected and Instagram had become more and more répandu, more and more, what do you call it, general, that's one of the works she showed in that show. And on the left, the posters that appeared all over New York, in which using that sort of 19th century language that she likes, sort of celebrated, students of color will eye her work suspiciously and exercise their free right to culturally annihilate her on social media. Parents will cover the eyes of innocent children, school teachers will re-examine their art history curricula, etc., etc. And of course, an image that circulated not only on wheat paper posters, but on the network itself, liked by 2,496 people. I'll accelerate a little bit. I don't want to talk too much about Instagram itself, because not just Instagram. I'm particularly interested in the role of the installation shot in contemporary art. These are some pictures that I pulled from a website that I think nobody in contemporary art discourse ever wants to talk about, which is Contemporary Art Daily. Do any of you know this? It was founded in 2008. These are pictures I picked totally at random. It could be New York, it could be Berlin, it could be Montreal, it could be Tokyo, I don't even know. But the fact that the installation shot becomes this sort of conditioning factor for so much of what's made, and particularly for sculpture, I would say, becomes, in the way that Walker and Ray and these other artists, I think, are having to think about, becomes this sort of next node in the chain. And if sculpture has had to sort of rely on the installation photograph, painting has it a little bit easier. You know, I just pulled from recent sort of auction results. On the left, Anna Weyand, on the right, Amy Sherald. This particular kind of sort of new painting that arrives in the 2010s with sort of hard edges, bright colors, and scales that are relatively close to squares that seem to function as JPEGs as well as paintings. I mean, it's no secret, maybe it is a little bit of a secret, that the art market didn't have such a bad turn in 2020 when the galleries and the museums all closed. That sort of after the sort of initial shock of the stock market falls of 2020, paintings in particular were selling quite well. Rebecca Quaitman, R.H. Quaitman, once told me this, that painting turns out to be the sort of secretly perfect digital medium. The question is, what kind of paintings, what kind of painting collectors are using this, and how, if you are a contemporary painter, if you're someone like me who cares about contemporary painting, might we begin to think in a more interesting way than what you're looking at here, in the way that Greece did, in the way that Picasso did, or like Paik did, or like Walker did, about how these how contemporary painting can take these conditions as the conditions that we all see in and not simply mimic them or profit from them. I think there are a few strategies, and I'll take you through those before opening up to questions. The first is, and these are not sort of conclusive how to be a good artist in the 21st century. These are simply sort of tendencies that I have admired among a number of artists for how to think this way. The first is to treat art and information as not identical forms, but things that overlap and transform them each other in ways that can't always be predicted. What you're looking at are two paintings by Jacqueline Humphreys, who I think is possibly the most interesting painter working in the sort of digital, in the sort of swim of digital imagery, who you know, an abstract painter, a gestural abstract painter, the one who uses silkscreens in the way that Warhol did, and other kinds of reproductive imagery in turn, and in particular uses not emoji, but what came before emoji, the emoticon, right? Like, do you remember for smiley face, you would do colon, close parenthesis? That earlier ASCII use of text for emotion, I'm not sure if I've got a better pic. I think I might have in a minute, in which you have paint, that is to say, paint applied with a brush, and also paint processed through a silkscreen, as being both gestural and informatic, both something that is done with the hand and something that is done in 3 dimensions and something that's done with ones and zeros. She wasn't the first. One painter, I think, who doesn't get enough credit for his technological engagement is Jack Whitten, who in the 1970s was working with Xerox to produce abstract paintings with certain kind of reproductive technologies. That one's in the Cleveland Museum, and it's, what do you call it? It's the Xerox machine's toner that is spread like what you would do on a printing sheet onto the canvas, and then is scraped or otherwise reformatted by hand. And so there is this kind of imbrication of, well, well, not digital, but reproductive and gestural work in Witten in the 1970s. You can see from this terrible moiré picture the kind of resistance to duplication that Witten produces and that Humphreys, I think, has probably learned from him. Ditto Albert Ullin, who in the 1990s was using sort of early desktop computing software. Like, did you guys ever have Print Shop, where you could like make like birthday invitations that you would print in your dot matrix printer, and the diagonal line would always be like a little like stair. You can't really see it in this, which is fine, but the diagonals on these are always a little janky and stepped. With Humphreys, what you're looking at is these sort of silk screens and painterly gestures that are layered over one another, but always remain a little bit flat in the way of the kind of, what's it called? The kind of, if you use like Purell before you went on your phone and you have the kind of smudge over information, that is the kind of experience. And they, of course, I think it's quite intentional, reproduce very badly with moiré ffects, hold on, I've got a close-up, right? So those are the smiley faces that are lashed through through the silk screen, and they're raised a little bit. They have a slight three-dimensionality, a slight bit of texture, and it's not just like colon, open face, parenthesis, but also earlier paintings by Humphreys that you can actually go and take a JPEG and convert it to ASCII. You would often do this with like early, text messages. Like, you could like make a little frame with like hyphens and brackets and things like that. She converts the painting into characters, which then become the source of the silk screen, which then get reproduced on later paintings, such that information and gesture, past and present, 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, get layered in this way that I find extremely relevant for how we all look at our screens today without ever resigning to the logic of the screen. It's something you see a little bit in also the work of Laura Owens on the left, Kelty Ferris on the right. This particular 3-dimensional flatness, the way in which the z-axis kind of collapses in the way of like many windows on a screen, is something that I think is a relatively new way of looking, and one that I don't think someone like Picasso or Rauschenberg would have understood. And also Julie Maritou, who I think has never been given her credit as a thinker about digital technology and about abstract painting more generally. Maritou, since the very beginning, has been pigeonholed, I think, for her engagement with globalization and with global networks, and that is one of her real concerns. With that said, she is an abstract painter, first and foremost, and this at the last paintings that was in the retrospective at the Whitney last year, in which, again, the incorporation of both the gesture and the silkscreen, and of both a particularly Maritou kind of mark-making, those black lines, and silk-screened passages that have an informational derivation, JPEGs that get simplified, or news imagery. There's a kind of overestimation in Maritou sometimes of like, this picture derives from a war. This one was a wildfire. I don't think that it's like magic eye. You're not supposed to like guess like what disaster is beneath the figures, but rather are supposed to think about this, the way in which information becomes a painterly tool and can be used in compositional forms that are relatively new, and in a way that I find not dissimilar to the way that Manet was thinking about the sort of integration of earlier reproductive imagery into his own work. Another way of doing this, of sort of resisting the logic of viral circulation, is to treat exhibitions and to treat works of art in themselves as things that don't stay put, as things that have lives, as things that function more like ecosystems than as objects or images. This, as you may know, is by Pierre Huyghe in the document of 2012, in which things that are made and things that are alive coexist, inform one another, are transformed by one another. Human, the dog with the pink forelimb on the right. Human, the dog, appeared in the show at the Pompidou, appeared at LACMA, had a way of sort of like walking into the video projections and kind of like, you know, snuggling up next to you. He was very sweet. And the idea that a work of art might not just be a series of images or a series of objects, but could have elements that either decay over time, that develop over time. This is the work in Münster in 2017 that incorporated not only this sort of if I'm not mistaken, an ice rink in the sort of industrial outskirts of Münster, but the tank, with various sort of prehistoric life forms and also cancer cells that were in a, a kind of petri dish that was generated, and various forms of sort of technological transformation. If I'm not, the lights would go on and off, the things at the top would open and close based on various biotic as opposed to technological stimuli. The ability of somebody like Pierre Huyghe to say, and this is at the Serpentine, these videos that were made with, brain scanning technology, but that themselves would transform the lighting in the space, that could be recombined based on various algorithms in ways that were unpredictable. This is, I think, an important way to say, you know, that the I was there Instagram shot is not going to suffice. Another way to do this, I think, is simply to heighten the contradictions a la Brecht, and to sort of play the conditions that we live out under for comedy. Somebody like Nell Belufa, this was the show at the Palais de Tokyo, in which the various forms of digital imagery get blown up, recirculated, reconstituted, and in particular, Nell's engagement not just with imagery but with algorithms is something that I think a lot of us can learn from. There's this wonderful film of his called Data for Desire, or sometimes called Desire for Data, I think he never determined, in which which, by the way, Canadian, you can see the moose here on the left, in which half the video is a kind of like MTV-style real-world reality show about who is going to fall in love with whom. And the other half is these mathematicians in Paris who are coming up with various algorithms to determine who is going to fall in love with whom, and how to reduce life to data.
And I am hoping to go to Europe as soon as I make enough money. I like volunteering. I volunteered all through university, and I know my end goal is I'm going to have a job where I help people. I don't know if it's going to be police work, social work, speech therapy. I'm pretty indecisive at this point, but I could fall into a lot of things. But I just know I want to help people, and I know like that's what I want.
And so the various mathematicians
would probably
say,
be
oh, I think that Joanne is going to fall in love with David because I've scored her 4 on charm and 7 on intelligence, et cetera, et cetera.
You can work so many hours, kill so much time, but you can't always get a vacation. You can't always get an experience. And I'd rather take an experience over working.
Belufa's sarcasm can wear on you if you're not into it, but I love it. And that particularly Brechtian sort of distanciation and heightening of various forms of the sort of social and political networks around individuals as opposed to their individual stories is one that I think makes him a particularly engaging contemporary artist, and one who has beat a lot of us to the punch. He made this in Banff, you may know it. This is Screen Talk, where he realized that there was going to be something about a global pandemic and people communicating over, it was Skype, not Zoom, in 2016, I believe it was. The last strategy I would insist upon is making the conditions of spectatorship into something that constitutes the work itself in the way that Kara Walker began to think about in 2014, and that I think has been done better than anybody by the work I think that might be the most important work of art of the last decade, which is Sun and Sea, the climate opera that premiered at the 2019 Venice Biennale by 3 Lithuanian artists whose names I have learned because I have had the occasion to praise them before, which is Rugile Barjukaicha, Vaiva Granita, and Lina Lapalita. And the pavilion of Lithuania is way out of the Giardini, and it was in this old naval site. And what would happen is that you arrived, and you would go up to the second floor, premier étage, as you say here, premier étage, and you would look down from the balcony, and you would see this performance on this artificial beach. It's an hour-long performance done on a loop, so you could come in, you could enter or exit at any time, and would sing this very benign, very digestible cantatas of sort of A Day at the Beach, Baby I Miss You, I Wonder If I Brought My Sunscreen, and slowly sort of begin to realize that the weather is a little hotter this summer than it was last summer, and it seems that like the leaves changed a little later than they had changed the year before, and when we took our trip to the Great Barrier Reef, we thought there was going to be more color. It was all a little whiter, and only in the lightest way do they begin to sort of sense that certain climatic things are coming unstuck, though hardly is it urgent enough to get them off of the beach. The point I want to make about it is that anybody could say climate change is bad, you should buy an electric car, and you should not fly to Venice. What was so important about Sun and Sea was that the performers were beneath you and singing on a loop while you were above and had this sort of God's eye view or drone's eye view of the performers. And of course, what you would get was the perfect photograph, the perfect phone shot. I was there on the very first day, and this is what it looked like, right? Rugile Barjukaicha, the director, is a film director before all. This was one of her first performances. And what was incredible is that the camera phone would be positioned parallel to the beach, such that the composition would fill the entire screen, and that as you would sort of like go through your photos the next day, they would look like your own photos from A Day at the Beach. And more than just that, the composition of the opera itself, in both the libretto and in the music, was in this recombinant, looped format, so that although the performance was an hour long, they realized that it was going to be encountered like this. And then later, now COVID times in Rome, when instead of doing it in an old naval site, they did it in the Teatro Argentino. They pulled out the stalls. And so the opera could be chopped up into these chunks and could be transmitted outside of the individual context in which it was made. And yet the very fact that it could be chopped up, and the very fact that it could be photographed, and that we were going to encounter it in this format, was itself fed back into the work as its own part of its very light but perfect indictment of our own sort of climate ignorance and climate comfort. That scrolling through the photos on your own phone or encountering these photos on other people's feeds was not simply an abbreviated clip, but was itself the work of art and was itself the message is a terrible word, but the importance of the work of art, that these things become digestible, become inoffensive, and become ambient in a way that seems to militate against the very thing that is reshaping all of our days at the beach. I'm just going to send one last thing, and then I'll open it up to questions. I'm going to speed through some dumb things about Bitcoin. These questions are not just questions for artists, but questions for art institutions. You're looking at the museum photographs of Thomas Struth that he made in the 1990s and 2000s, where, of course, these are the Prado. Although, actually, the Prado, one of the last museums that still has a no-photo policy. And, you know, when Struth was photographing these museums, this was, again, you know, a moment when mass tourism had become a real driver of attendance at museums, but where the front-facing camera had not yet been developed, and certain kinds of self-fashioning at the museum had not yet taken place. Contrast that with an institution I find one of the most fascinating, though scary places on this continent, which is the former Indianapolis Museum of Art, now known as Newfields, because the consultants told them that museum was a dirty word. And Newfields is a place for many different things. You can see art, you can play mini golf, you can go to the food truck, and you can encounter works like this, which, when I first saw this, I thought was a sculpture by Katharina Fritsch. It is not a sculpture by Katharina Fritsch, it's just a big blue snail that they commissioned in order for people to have something to photograph when they got to the atrium. And what do you know, it worked. That this thing became important simply by the precession of Instagram imagery, and people came to take a photograph with the blue snail because other people had taken a photograph with the blue snail. I don't mean to sort of piss all over people who take a photo with the blue snail. I do mean to suggest that works of art become known in part not through people like me, not anymore, but through all of us. And encountered in different places and in different formats. And that can be translated and transmitted. This, of course, is the, what's it called? The Chris Burden at LACMA, which has been ripped off in Indonesia and can be reproduced sort of at scale. On the left, the actual Yayoi Kusama obliteration room, and on the right, one that you can order up. And I couldn't help but put in that on the left, this is me in the actual Yayoi Kusama, and on the right, at my cousin's bat mitzvah, where you can order up a sort of Kusama infinity room. I don't want to suggest that Instagram is determinant of all. What I want to suggest simply is that we are hardly the first to have our social life bleeding through or overtaking certain kinds of artistic autonomy. And I always come back to the very salons that Manet was rejected from, in which Daumier would brutally caricature not just the artists, but the public. Et toi, qu'est-ce que tu trouves du meilleur du salon? Au salon cette année, la bière. So long before Newfields had opened, people were already going to art institutions for refreshments or for various forms of public display, public encounter, and public performance. The question is not like, how do you get back to the good old days when art was pure, when art was autonomous, and when people knew how to behave better than apparently they were doing in 1875? No. The question is, can you toggle between tabs in the way that we all toggle between tabs 100 times a day, between different kinds of looking, different kinds of engagement, different kinds of political or social forms of looking, that allows you to think in ways that go past the received algorithmic viral forms of looking that were allegedly social, but in fact we know are quite antisocial. The artist of the 21st century is the artist, I think, who can do that, right? The artist of the 21st century is the artist who shows you, in the way that Kara Walker does, or Jacqueline Humphreys does, or Neil Balufa does, how to toggle between tabs, and to sort of show you the life that is lived between the moments of your Instagram feed, and not the images themselves. All the rest is just content. I'll stop there. I'm sure there are questions. I just want to thank you so much for not just being such a good audience, but a public audience. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was a wonderful talk, so fascinating. So we have two mics, one on that side and one on this side, so just lift your hand.
A little long, I'm sorry.
Hello. Just wondering, as someone with a kind of limited understanding of blockchain technology, et cetera, what exactly is a non-fungible token?
You know, the worst question you can ask is a factual one. I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but if other people are better than me, they can. A token is just Bitcoinese for a string of alphanumeric characters that can be recorded on a blockchain, that is to say, on a decentralized database. A Bitcoin is a token. Ethereum and other kinds of cryptocurrencies are tokens. Most tokens are valued in one-to-one relationship. 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin in the way that $1 equals $1. They are therefore fungible. A non-fungible token, by contrast, is one whose value is assessed independently from all other tokens, like a painting, right? Like this Monet is not the same as that Monet, to say nothing of this Monet as being the same as that Hokusai, or something like this. So the non-fungible token is an electronic record of ownership whose value is independent of all other tokens. Does that in any way record anything interesting about the image or about the object that is associated? No. There is no particular electronic, or there is, but there's no crypto recording of the individual image. That is still dependent on social belief and on public recognition that A1, B2, C3 equals your ownership of the sort of Beeple JPEG. In that way, I believe, non-fungible tokens and other forms of crypto in the art world do not represent such a meaningful jump from, say, artist rights contracts and other forms of legal ownership of conceptual art in the 1960s. What is new is the fact that these things can be valued, bought, and sold away from places like art galleries and away from the complete disapproval of snobbish critics like me. I hope that helped. We've got one in the front, and I think we're being recorded, so if you, it's right behind you.
Seated here. Enjoyed your, I'm sorry, thank you. Oui, Monsieur Farago, the Chicago Farago, yeah. Enjoyed your rhizomatic Deleuzian talk, but the one name that was never mentioned, and I'm curious to know why, or perhaps how it fits into the context of your thesis, Walter Benjamin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Benjamin and the Frankfurt School more generally are definitely important figures in my own thinking about value and art. Most obviously, as many of you may know, Benjamin's the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, which is published, is it 35? I forget, in which Benjamin denigrates most modern art by having lost its aura, its sort of, what do you call it? Its sort of godlike presence in the face of its ability to be reproduced. I don't discount Benjamin out of hand. I suppose what I find interesting in Benjamin, though also what I'm skeptical of in Benjamin, is the kind of turn to the clouds that he always seems to make at the end in, oh God, I'm blanking on the concept of history. Is that what it's called? In the 1939-1940, in which he's writing about Paul Klee's Angelus Novus as the sort of angel of history, and seems to make a very clean distinction between what is high and what is low as being what is good and what is bad. And if Benjamin does that, Adorno does it sort of 10 times more. I'm pretty Adornian in my own conception of, and my own sort of skepticism of popular culture. I can be snobbish when the time is right. What I don't believe is that there is something about the handmade, or there is something about the presence of an individual, irreproducible thing that gives it more aura than, say, a daguerreotype. And I think that what is interesting is to think about how auras get established not by God and not by the artist's own hand, but by society in ways that might change over time. That's my Frankfurt School in a nutshell thesis, forgive me. We have here in the front.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. I kept thinking when you were showing the movie on Turner and some of these early slides you showed of image technologies, of Balzac's fear of being photographed because it would kind of turn him into a ghost, and this notion that part of his outer layers of skin would be taken away by,
yes,
by the process of photography. And I suppose I'm thinking about how that relates to photography with the iPhone for Instagram now, and I guess my question is, do you think that works of art are becoming their own ghost through technologies like Instagram?
It's a valid question. It's not an easy question. I think that you're right to raise the example of Balzac, though I would add, my talk is sort of unashamedly but admittedly provincial, and this is a very Western view of a lot of things, and particularly among indigenous populations in this country, on this continent, and in Australia. Skepticism about photographic reproduction as having some kind of spiritual compromise, if not being entirely invalid, is something that has a long history. The question, I don't want to be, the okay boomer of the millennials and say that authenticity is what happens in 3 dimensions and the screen is where you go to die. I would suggest that there is something reduced, that's why they call them profiles, you can see half, about this kind of reproductive imagery, and that I think COVID did an important job in underlining. I mean, young people don't seem to have had a great 2 years looking at the screen entirely. And the kind of anxiety, the kind of depression, and the kind of need to constantly perform that these kind of networks seem to be exerting, not entirely on young people, on people of all ages, but particularly on young people, does, I think, verify your point that there is something ghostly, there is something deathly about that kind of reproduction. As to the question of whether objects of art, works of art themselves, I think that question is open, but I would say, again, in the way of somebody like Walker or somebody like Humphreys, the goal is not to say, how can I preserve everything that is vital in person in this form of reproduction, but how can my sort of larger interests, my larger project, be sustained as the thing that I made in my studio goes through this series of more or less accurate, more or less controlled forms of reproduction and of circulation and of mutation and of migration. That's a tough question, and one I think that people like Walker and Humphreys have done a very good job giving us models for, though one that I don't think will ever be satisfied 100%.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for that talk. It was really, really wonderful. Apologies if this is a naive question, because I'm a poet, not an artist. But I was wondering, with those paintings that you showed with the green beams and
yes,
the ribbons coming down, if these sort of like bright colors and hyperrealism are a kind of trend, like, as you're saying, in contemporary painting, and if that has to do with what is eye-catching, like the blue snail?
Yes, and when you say eye-catching, the question is, where does it catch the eye? I don't want to say that Amy Sherald and Anna Wyant don't care about the experience of the gallery. I'm sure they do. And Amy Sherald in particular, as someone who spent much of her time as a portrait painter, which is a relatively less prestigious form of art making than maybe what you call studio art, I'm sure takes these things very seriously. With that said, the kind of prefiguration of a painting's reproduction as something that is always going to be part and parcel of the work, and even if you want it to be more cynical, your own adoption in your own eye of certain kinds of looking and certain overestimation of images. I mean, there's a way in which paintings like that seem to function in the same way as like the highly Instagrammable coffee shop, where there are certain kinds of, what do you call them? Drop lighting over the tables that you can get the perfect shot of your salad, and certain flat colors behind you. There is something, I think, that is congruent with that. That isn't to say that that may be, if I were a more cynical person, hard to imagine that is possible, in honest reckoning with the contemporary conditions by which someone like you or someone like me might first encounter these paintings. That painting by Amy Sherald on the right was in Los Angeles. I never saw it. Right? I saw it only in reproduction. And that may be an honest reckoning with the contemporary conditions under which we encounter art that is not so dissimilar from how people thought in the modern era. I don't think it's the most productive or the most intriguing form, but it is one that might have something behind it.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering a bit about how you saw, and maybe, I noticed you didn't include it in your talk, but I'm wondering if you've been thinking about it at all, like the way in which augmented reality might start to figure, and also like 3D scanning technologies, because I started to think about the installation view that you showed, and maybe like the next progression of that would be to actually just be in the space of the gallery virtually, or like these sorts of things, and how you see that in relationship.
3D printing is something I take very seriously as a technology that is not so dissimilar from how somebody like Canova in the 18th century would have made a lot of works. What you do with 3D printing largely is you have an object, you scan it into X, Y, and Z coordinates, and then you output it in whether that's in a positive, like printing it with wax or something, or in a negative, you make a mold that you can enlarge, and then you fill the mold with metal. And somebody like Charles Ray, I think, is an incredible example of an artist who is both incredibly gifted with his hands and someone who is using the most advanced forms of CNC milling and other forms of 3D printing in order to make works of art that can only be understood as sculptures and have to be experienced in the gallery. So no, I think 3D printing is an absolutely relevant form of making. As for augmented reality, I don't know. They never seem to work for me. Like, I hold my screen up and like, there's always, I don't know, the internet's not working or something. Stan Douglas did one where you had to like walk around like this. And I was like, well, I'd rather just watch the video. I don't know, maybe there are some brilliant AR artists. I've never seen them. But I can tell you this, the VR, where you have to put the thing on your head, I mean, I've done the Dominique Gonzalez-Forster one. I've done a couple of them. They always seem to hurt my eyes. And again, I think the sort of honest conception of what it means to be someone living in a world of screens in the 21st century is not immersive in that way. I don't think we sort of left the world of flesh and blood and went into the sort of pure realm of the digital. I think that what we're always doing, and this is something I think Guido Steyrl might be the most gifted artist in thinking about, is we're constantly sort of living in a world in which on and offline impinge on one another in ways that are a little bit crummy and a little bit broken and a little bit unpredictable, and that digital images might sort of flood, that you might sort of encounter a digital image while you're making your toast, and you might encounter a painting while sort of Googling a flight. And that kind of promiscuity between on and offline is, I think, a more productive thing for artists to be thinking about than the sort of ex nihilo creation of new worlds.
dernière question.
Merci.
Great talk. Every time I meet somebody who has an IT degree, I say the future belongs to you. But my question is, for artists that orient their work according to the latest social media thing or the latest technology, AR, whatnot, 3D, Instagram, do you think that there are a few, or more than a few, or almost all that are really just suffering from FOMO and want to be cool and want to be avant-garde and want to be, you know?
It's a good question. I would remind you that for every Picasso and Braque in Greece, there were 2,500 other Cubist painters who wanted to follow the latest thing, and 3 years later sort of said, like, I can do angles, and I can do... And so, you know, you have a point. One of the interesting things about digital technology today is that while we seem to be living in a moment that's more and more digital, novelty does not seem to be something that we experience as often as we used to, right? Like, we spend more and more time on our screens, and yet what do we always say? There's nothing to watch on Netflix, right? That there is this moment in which the future has come, and it's more boring and more repetitive. And so the point you raise about leading or following, creating or imitating, is an interesting question, but ultimately I would suggest a sociological question as opposed to a question about aesthetic judgment. And I think the interesting question is, how does a place like an art school, or how does a place like an art magazine or an art museum inculcate into a young artist's realm the ability to say, the thing that you're seeing on Instagram and that everybody is sharing is one really important thing that you should absolutely be paying attention to. And you can even like put like the heart emoji and say, I'm so proud of you, when your friend gets a show. And that's one thing among many from the Greek and Roman and African and Asian collections of this museum to the news of the day, to the books that are musting in the library. All of which is supposed to feed into a contemporary digital life that takes place in books and on screens, that take place in flesh and in ones and zeros. I don't necessarily think it's easy, but I do think that it's a more honest and a more a fuller recognition of how all of us encounter things, both online and off, than it is to say the screen is reality and everything is digital. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Jason.